Back when I was in middle school, I started dabbling in writing fantasy stories. The quality of those stories is debatable, but I vividly remember pouring many hours into how the abilities of different characters worked. I would classify different types of powers, name the hierarchies of magic users, and detail what was possible with each type of magic. I even had notes on what I, as the writer, wanted to explain to the readers and what I wanted to keep vague or hidden. Looking back on it, it was pretty good for a 10-year-old. But I think the most interesting thing about all of it in retrospect was that I had written much of it well before I had decided anything about a plot. I was world building, and I didn't even know it. When people discuss world building in the context of fantasy worlds, magic systems are often a major part of the conversation. There are many ways the writer can go about handling the magic in their world. It could remain vague and leave its details to the imagination of the reader. It could go deep into defining the laws and rules by which the world operates. But what the writer decides to do with the magic isn't the important thing. It's how the writer utilizes the system in support of the narrative. But Touhou doesn't really have a narrative. It's a world that can facilitate many narratives. It's not Touhou the story, it's Gensokyo, where many different stories take place. Even then, its magic system supports the construction of its world and stories. But how? Some of you might be familiar with soft and hard magic systems. These terms were coined by Brandon Sanderson, a high fantasy and science fiction author best known for his Mistborn series, or more relevantly, his fictional universe Cosmere, where most of his works are set. He made these terms as a way to categorize fantasy worlds. With hard magic systems, the mechanics and rules for how the magic are explicitly given to the reader, enough that the reader themselves would be able to explain roughly what the character must do to use specific magic. Meanwhile, soft magic systems may not clearly define everything, or when they do, the explanation is purposefully limited, omitting details that would give the reader the full picture. And while it may be easy to dismiss soft systems as less creative or thoughtful, there are benefits to keeping the explanations of your magic sparse. In addition to these terms, Sanderson defines 3 laws of magic, though in his own words, while I call them laws, they're nothing more than simple guidelines that have worked for me. Just like sometimes it's good to violate rules of grammar, authors can violate my theories and still have good books. The rules in question are as follows. An author's ability to solve conflict with magic should be directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. Weaknesses, limits, and costs are more interesting than powers. The author should expand on what is already a part of the magic system before something else new is added, as this may change how the magic system fits into the fictional world. These rules are nice for writers, but what about his definition of hard and soft systems? Well, in Sanderson's own words, this separation of soft and hard is not a strict binary of one or the other. Most writers are somewhere in the middle between these two extremes. These terms are just analysis guidelines. They should never interfere with a writer's organic creativity. But if so, wouldn't that make these segregational terms completely reductive, simply forcing everything into a singular box with arbitrary boundaries regardless of accuracy? Colors are a spectrum with no discrete boundaries. Are words like red, blue, green, and white bad even though they do the same thing? Of course not. I don't want to get too deep into philosophy of mind, but qualia, which is the subjective qualities we personally attribute to something, are just that. Subjective. Your idea of red and my idea of red will differ slightly, but neither of us would even have an idea of what red is without the word, the concept. For example, the sentence, "That red fruit is safe to eat," would be impossible to understand. Language gives us a common ground where our subjective thoughts can meet. We can describe someone's narrative world as hard or soft, thanks to shared context on what those terms mean. But more importantly, these categorizations give us an idea on how the writer intended the reader to interface with their work, why their magic is presented as such. So with that in mind, I want to look at where Touhou fits in this hard-soft dichotomy. And if it wasn't obvious yet, Touhou doesn't fit squarely into either category. However, I can do the next best thing. I created this graph to illustrate the hardness of each aspect of Touhou's world building that involves some degree of magic. We'll be going over each of these from hardest to softest, giving examples and explaining how its usage affects Touhou's world building overall. So of course, we'll be starting with what I have labeled the core. This is what I consider the singular axiom of Gensokyo's magic system. It is the foundation that everything else in the setting rests upon. Reality is shaped by humanity's collective belief. Back before science could provide adequate answers to the natural phenomena around us, gods and yokai were believed to be real, and thus they were. However, as technology improved and gave humanity provable answers that didn't rely on supernatural entities, that belief quickly waned. And for gods and yokai whose entire existence is predicated on that collective belief, that meant their existence was in jeopardy. Thus, Gensokyo became a necessity for the continued existence of the supernatural. This singular rule establishes Gensokyo as a setting. It needs to be explicitly defined, especially when this rule sometimes comes into play narratively. To go back to Sanderson's first law, an author's ability to solve conflict with magic should be directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. A good example of this comes directly from Kaneko in Symposium of Post-Mysticism. Gods are beings that will cease to exist without humans believing in them. Just believing that we're real is enough. In the outside world, they've stopped believing that we even exist. Indeed, everything changed once we came to Gensokyo. Here, humans believe that we exist as an everyday fact. Gensokyo is a safe haven for the supernatural, away from the logic of society. This statement is all you need to understand the setting. And in the words of Sanae Kochiya, you can't let yourself be held back by common sense in Gensokyo, right? Funnily enough, despite Gensokyo's barrier being one of the things we know the most about, and take that with a grain of salt, it's probably one of the hardest to explain. It's called the barrier of common sense, but its mechanics are anything but. Formerly known as the Great Hakurei Barrier, this was the culmination of what was known as the Yokai Expansion Project, spearheaded by Yukari Yakumo. This barrier was the solution to the problem we just looked at. If humans continue to lose faith in the supernatural, why not create a place where humans have no choice but to believe in it? A barrier which separates logic from fantasy. A barrier of common sense in the most literal of forms. So let's list out what we know about it. It is designed such that nothing can consciously come in or out, not one or the other. Yokai who enter Gensokyo are expected to stay in Gensokyo. That first point in mind, the Hakurei Shrine is technically the only way in and out, but there are exceptions. The spiriting away phenomenon, which is believed to be the work of Yukari Yakumo, can cause things that would normally be rejected by the barrier to pass through at random. Likewise, a few yokai claim to have secret methods of passing in and out as they wish, though the truth of this has only been hinted at. And as a final exception, rather than bypassing the barrier, one could technically tear a hole in it and walk out like normal. Things that are starting to become forgotten in the outside world have an easier time passing through the barrier naturally. This could include animals that are going extinct, or even just toys that went out of style. This is one way humans with no outside connections get spirited away. Things like rain, snow, sunlight, and rivers that flow to or from the outside world are all unaffected by the barrier. Nature passes through as though it didn't exist. Even though the barrier is often drawn like a dome, it extends to the underground as well. But more importantly, the edges of the barrier have non-Euclidean properties. To explain with an example, if someone were to try and run as far as they could out the edge of the barrier, they would begin passing by familiar landmarks as though they were running in circles. And the moment they turn around to make their way back, even if they had been running for an hour straight, they would likely find themselves right where they had started. Gensokyo is not the only realm on the fantasy side of the barrier. The lunar capital has a similar barrier that hides it from the outside world, one that may have inspired Gensokyo's. It's also possible to travel there from Gensokyo without going through the outside world. Some realms, such as Old Hell and the Netherworld, can be accessed in Gensokyo directly, while others can be accessed with special means, such as Makai or the Dream World. Honestly, it's the non-Euclidean space bit that trips people up, but these are the main things we know about the barrier. It's a lot, isn't it? I would say there are a few aspects that are up for interpretation, such as why the barrier tends to fluctuate in certain places. However, I would consider the barrier a classic example of hard magic. Fans usually can explain in their own words how it works, and there's a simple reason why the Hakurei barrier of all things is like this. It's because Zune loves using its properties as plot points. He's been doing it since Touhou 7, to his earliest manga series, all the way to recent developments. If Zune wants to have plot beats involving the barrier, depending on what he's trying to explain, he needs the reader to understand certain mechanics. Again, Sanderson's first law, and as a result, one of the most confusing topics ends up being the one thing we understand the most. Luckily, these next few should be easier to explain, but they will need a bit of leading into. So let's talk about one of the oldest concepts in the series, the Spellcard System. The rules themselves obviously aren't magic. They're rules of engagement for when two characters want to settle a dispute. However, the creation and use of these spell cards are fully defined. Perfect Memento in strict sense gives us the original draft of the rules. However, I want to go over the three that pertain to the spell cards themselves. Combatants will give names and meanings to the duel for the benefit of beauty. Combatants may not deliver attacks that do not have meaning. The meaning itself becomes the attack's power. Combatants will write the duel's name on paper in the format of a contract. These papers will be called spell cards. This actually tells us a lot. Spell cards require names and meaning behind them in order to be used. The cards themselves are simply contracts that follow dueling protocol rather than actual magic. So what about non-spells? Well, keep in mind that this was just a first draft of the rules, so things like non-spells may have been added after the fact. But I think I have an answer to this as well. If the cards aren't magic, what about the Danmaku? Well, going by the grimoire of Marissa and Usami, the magic, or Danmaku in this case, can be anything the user is capable of doing as long as it doesn't violate the rules. Patrulli's Danmaku is her actual magic, but meanwhile, Minoriko has a spell card that is just her throwing baked sweet potatoes, which is to say, while I think the spellcard system is hard magic, the hardness of Danmaku is actually completely dependent on its source. Some spell cards could be a character doing something physically, some could utilize a type of magic they know, or finally, they could be created through the use of a character's special ability. This would of course apply to the non-spells as well. So in summary, the spellcard system is a hard magic system fought with soft magic attacks. Honestly, the only thing I don't understand is how some of these characters know about the spellcard rules if they're complete newcomers to Gensokyo, or for that matter, how On had spellcards ready minutes after being born. With that out of the way, we can talk about each of these soft magics, and surprisingly enough, the type we know the most about is character abilities. I made a whole video on this topic, 2 if you count the one dedicated just to explaining how cool Reimu's ability is. Sanderson's second law states, weaknesses, limits, and costs are more interesting than powers. And yet, we are not only given no limitations for most abilities, but we barely know what they can do. So, is this an example of Zune failing as a writer? I actually don't think so. Character abilities are mostly flavor text, or at best an explanation for their Danmaku patterns, such as Kyoko's reflective sound bullets. But in the event that an ability is used to solve some plot points or be put into action, it is usually one that we have been given explicit understanding of. Yukari uses her gaps during Silent Sinner and Blue in order to accomplish her master plan, but her ability isn't simply go in one gap, come out the other. She manipulates boundaries, and we are given very explicit explanation of just what that can entail. The ability to manipulate boundaries is a terrifying ability capable of fundamentally undermining reality. It goes without saying, but everything is built upon the existence of boundaries. If there was no water surface, there could be no lake. If there was no skyline, neither mountain nor sky could exist. Were it not for the Great Barrier, even Gensokyo itself would not exist. If there were no boundaries, everything would probably exist as a single enormous object. Thus, the ability to manipulate boundaries is logically an ability of creation and destruction. Flandra is another great example of this. Her ability is to destroy absolutely anything, and it comes into play during Touhou 17.5, and all the way back in 2005 when Bohemian Archive in Japanese Red came out, she explains explicitly how her ability works, albeit in a rather childish manner. Everything has an eye. If I squeeze that eye, it will go kaboom. Zune only tends to use character abilities narratively if he has explicitly defined them. In all other cases, they are textbook soft magic. Soft magic allows the writer to maintain a sense of mystery without limiting future creativity. The more the magic is defined, the more red tape they need to walk around in order to avoid contradictions while adding new things. In Zune's case, he's actually said this is a big reason why he tries not to give too many details. This way, abilities give a bit more flavor to each character without creating additional narrative restrictions to the series. And finally, the softest part of Touhou's magic, the magic. Pretty much everything else not covered by character abilities falls under this category. And while we have a few distinct categories that magic can fall into, a lot of it has no identifiable source, magic unrelated to a character ability or known magic category. Usually these are yokai abilities that we can hand wave with, the yokai can do it because it's a yokai. These in particular are our examples of 100% soft magic. Magic that has no logical explanation because it doesn't need any. So if you were hoping for an answer about why pretty much every character can fly, the answer is simple. They just can. But what about our other categories of magic? Or what about the other forms of magic we haven't seen in canon yet? Well, what if I told you we can actually do a lot better than just dismissing Touhou's magic as inexplicable nonsense? This is actually really simple, and it's all thanks to what we talked about at the beginning, the core. Reality is shaped by humanity's collective belief. We can apply this rule to every magic system. I've explained in a few videos how Pachuli's magic uses the wuxing phases. This magic is more formally known as feng shui, or Chinese geomancy, which uses the energies within our environment. And sure enough, her article in Perfect Memento in Strict Sense supports this. This form of magic is also very well documented, meaning if you were to learn how it operates, you could put it into practice in Gensokyo. But even between magicians, the source of their magic can differ. Marissa's magic is alchemical and involves using magical ingredients found within the Forest of Magic. As for Alice, her dolls are controlled via magic threads. How does she make the threads, you ask? We don't know. Soft magic. But typically, a lot of magic that doesn't fall under a specific category could be considered yojutsu, or yokai arts. Hojutsu, or dharmic arts, are Buddhist supernatural abilities. These techniques are usually in the form of reciting sutras, nothing fancy like yojutsu. And if you ask, what about Byakuren? Most of her magic is actually yojutsu. She's more of a magician than a dharmic arts practitioner. Senjutsu, or hermit arts, are a little more interesting. This magic is used by hermits who gain their abilities through rigorous training. They will spend most of their days praying, eating very little food, and every several hundred years they have to deal with an assassin from hell. But on the bright side, they get some cool shit like teleportation and secret hermit homes. For instance, Miko used Senjutsu to create Senkai as a home for her and her followers. Onmyodo, the way of yin and yang, is actually a composite of different magics combining Taoist alchemy, feng shui, Buddhist sutras, Shinto, and other sources. This is actually what both Yukari and Reimu used for some of their abilities. This magic is mainly for divination and enchantments. Anytime you see Reimu putting sealing amulets on something or erecting magic barriers, she's using Onmyodo. It can also be used to have summoned spirits possess creatures and have them act as servants. These are known as Shikigami, with examples being Ran and Chen. There are also a few other miscellaneous magics or magic-like abilities such as Qi, which Mei Ling can utilize. But since we've talked about some of the more religious magics, let me address one more thing. In the comments for my survival video, a few of you seem to believe that being religious and getting sent to Gensokyo is enough to give you magic. Look, I don't care how pious you are. Jesus isn't going to give you protect from melee. You're Christian? Okay. What magic spells do Christians use? How do they cast them? Do they have any? If your religious texts of choice don't detail any magics, then there's no magic to learn. Again, reality is shaped by humanity's collective belief. The key word here is collective. Your personal belief will not supersede the majority. But if you were curious, Christians were probably one of the greatest contributors to Western magic despite modern faith considering it satanic. Even the Bible condemns sorcery, thereby acknowledging its existence. But if one were to learn ancient sorceries like Enochian magic, they could theoretically be used in Gensokyo. And this can be applied to any other form of magic, each abiding by its own rules. And that brings us to the end of my little graphic here. But there is one more thing to discuss. While Sanderson did define 3 laws of magic, he actually created a 0th law. Always err on the side of what is awesome. Of all of these rules, I think this is the one that Zun best embodies. He only uses hard magic when absolutely necessary. This results in a mostly soft system, leaving him free range to be as creative as he likes. These softer aspects, not just with magic, but with every facet of Touhou's world building, are a large part of why it's so conducive to fan creations. I talked about this briefly in my video on Joyful's Yoreimu, but now that I've explained the magic system, I can talk about how it affects Touhou's most important aspect, its characters. Zun loves using unreliable narration in his written works, narratives that are perfectly okay with lying to the reader. I can't count the number of YouTube comments I get saying Perfect Memento in Strict Sense is an unreliable source for this reason. While I would say that its dubious comments and outright lies are easy to pick out, this does touch on something rather interesting. Why? Let's look at Flandre's ability again. While she does give us a good idea of how it works, this is also the key to everything I've been leading up to. We only know what she told us. While she may have been truthful, she may have also lied or left out key details. She might not even understand it correctly herself. Every single character ability is self-declared. But this isn't limited to abilities or even Perfect Memento in Strict Sense. All of Zun's writing does this. Do you think Yuyuko is going all out when she's a stage 1 boss? What about Hakaria, who Zun said is far stronger than any character introduced at that point? And then you have Alice, who claims she never uses her full power. Is she even telling the truth? How many yokai aren't holding back? Is Yukari secretly a lot weaker than she leads on? And by the way, this is a big reason why power level discussion immediately goes out the window. Sorry, not sorry. But again, I'm going to ask the question, why? Not to answer it though. The answer is the question. If that doesn't make sense, let me put it this way. Because there is a question and no obvious answer, fan creativity is invited to create one. For as much as we know about each and every character, Zune keeps that information as soft as possible, malleable for more liberal interpretation. Fans can take their beloved characters and fill in the blanks as they see fit, and in some cases, elevate and surpass its source material. I subscribe to the belief that this is why Touhou always felt like it had a much higher concentration of creative fans compared to most other communities. It beckons these fans into participating in its own creation, which is to say, it is Touhou's magic that builds its community. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you again soon.